Okay, so that's Deuteronomy 1 through 19. Thanks for the effort there. Some of you had some really long verses there. Some of you had a couple of short ones. So some of you got away with it. Well, we're just going to look at these 19 verses, and next week, God willing, we'll look at verse 20 onwards. And we begin to look at the address that Moses makes to the people that starts in verse 6 and ends in chapter 4, verse 43. So it's a 3 or 4 chapter long sermon. So Moses here, where he shows that he's addressing Israel according to verse 3. It's addressed to the redeemed people of God, and they were getting ready to cross over the Jordan into the promised land. But Moses himself will not go in. He desperately wants to go in. He's quite bitter about the fact he's not going in, but it's not going to happen anyway. And they've just ended up north of the Red Sea, Dead Sea, even not Red Sea, the Dead Sea. They are much further north than the first time they were supposed to go into the promised land. So you've got the Dead Sea, it's just above it, and they're coming from this side to cross over the Jordan. So this is the river Jordan coming down into the Dead Sea. Well, the first place they were supposed to go to a place. They were originally at a place called Kadesh Barnea, a place that we'll return to by the end of by next week. At the end of this chapter, Kadesh Barnea. Oh boy, that's not a good map, is it? Well, anyway, so this is present day Israel up here. Kadesh Barnea is here, which is where they were supposed to be going into from there. Instead, they did all this long circular route and ended up here to cross. Okay, so that was a 38-year journey just to get there. All right, so that's quite something, isn't it? They didn't cross over at the same place that they were originally went to. I think probably because there are pretty negative memories about that place, and it's not a place they wanted to go back to, because this was the place that they refused to obey God the first time they had the opportunity to go into the promised land. So the place that they were about to cross, let me just go back here so that you can see that. The place that they were about to cross was just across, well, we know it's just across from Jericho, but it's also from the place called Moreh, which we find in Genesis 12, verses 6 and 7. That's where Abraham was told that this would be the land given to his descendants. And it was here that Abraham built an altar to the Lord, and which actually, when the Israelites crossed over the Jordan, that's where they would renew the covenant with God in relation to the land. But of course, Moses wasn't going to be there to do it with them. This is when Joshua has taken over the reins of the leadership. This place that they're about to cross is almost literally halfway between the north and the south of Israel, the boundaries of the north and the south of Israel. It should have taken 11 days, as we read in verse 2, but instead it took them 40 years. When they arrived at Jordan the first time, it was supposed to be tomorrow they would go into the land. That tomorrow took a rather long, detourious route. Now, the previous generation has all died. All died in the desert, apart from who were the 3 who survived? Remember from last week? Yeah, Moses. It wasn't Aaron. Close? No. Joshua's son of Nun. I know we like to pronounce it as Nun, but who's the third person? Caleb. That's right, Caleb. That's it. Thank you very much. That's right. There's Moses, Joshua, and Caleb, who are still alive at this point in time, whilst Moses is preaching his first of 3 sermons on that side of the Jordan. And then Moses and the priests, the Levites, spoke to all Israel. That's verse 27, verse 9. Take heed and listen, O Israel. This day you have become the people of the Lord your God. So a covenant has been renewed between God and them. They are reaffirmed as the people of God. They are the army of God, a spiritual force, not just a political or secular army. And this sermon that Moses speaks gives a history of what had happened before, from verse 6 through to chapter 4, just prior to giving the Ten Commandments all over again. I'll just show you this map. So this is how the land was divided to all Israel, and they are here right now. So remember that these three tribes, they decided, well, we're going to have land on this side of the Jordan rather than on the other side of the Jordan. So they've been given this land, but they have to go in ahead of everyone else to fight in the armies of Joshua, and they're crossing over into what became Benjamin's land. It was a small piece of land because they were a small tribe, of course. Benjamin was originally the tribe of Joseph, okay, along with East and West Manasseh. So first, we see that Moses expounds on the history of what has gone on before. And so first of all, we see the history of the Exodus. That's that first generation of people when they arrived at the southern border of what became Israel. And we see that through to chapter 2, verse 1. And then after that, with the new generation that are present, he will go through what's happened over the last few weeks with the defeat of a couple of armies, a couple of kings. And then in chapter 4 is a history of remembering the grace of God through both of those times. That is a call to faithfulness to him, because they have seen the works of God. Both generations have seen the works of God. The first generation saw what happened in the land of Egypt. But now, this new generation, they've seen two kings defeated. They've seen God's hand upon them. It was a divine work of defeat upon these two nations. And now they're about to cross over again. Of course, and they also grew up in the time when the manna was given to them, that they had water coming from stones and all this kind of stuff. And we'll see a little bit more on that at another time. The whole point is that we are to remember the lessons of history. I don't know who it was who actually said it first, but if we don't remember our history, we're destined to repeat it. Of course, that's what all this whole palaver about the anti-Semitism is about right now. This is a history that can be repeated. It might not seem like it, but it started small in Germany in the 1930s, and it just grew in crescendo and ended up with millions of Jews being exterminated as a result. And history can repeat itself. It has repeated itself because these things happened in the 1500s as well. This happened all through down for the centuries. Anyhow, that's not about this. Moses then spends all of one verse to explain 38 years in the desert. That's how much he wants to focus upon that time. And the rest of the chapter is given over to what takes place over the course of a few weeks. And why so little detail? Well, the wanderings in the desert are not significant in the history of Israel. You might think it is significant, but it is not, because the whole wanderings in the desert was for God to get rid of all the previous generation. That was the whole purpose of their wanderings. But at the time at Kadesh Barnea, where they should have gone into the land, Moses is still livid about that, and he spends the latter half of this chapter just going on about that, and we'll see there are good reasons for that. And they were only there for 2 weeks, but he spends the greater chunk of this chapter in that area. So how much territory has Israel been given? Deuteronomy 1 verse 7, which we read, says this: turn and take your journey, go to the mountains of the Amorites, to all the neighbouring places in the plain, in the mountains and in the lowland, in the south and on the sea coast, to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. So just how big is the territory that has been given to Israel? And it may come as a giant surprise, and it should be a giant surprise. We can find that this says again in Deuteronomy 11 verse 24. It says, every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours, from the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, even to the western sea shall be your territory. So what is, first of all, the river and the river Euphrates? So the first river is the river Nile. Then you also have the river Euphrates. Does anyone know where the river Euphrates is? Well, your river Euphrates runs through Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. In fact, the eastern border of the Euphrates is what marks out Iraq and Iran. That is a big area we're talking about here. That much area, all in the light green, is what has been promised to Israel. Not much then. Where are they now? Well, they're kind of really still centered in this mass here, aren't they? Even today. So we see that the part that Moses went into, that's the dark green bit over here, and then this bit here became the territory in King David and King Solomon's time. The rest of that land they have never had. Not yet. Okay. So clearly Moses considered going over the Jordan to be the entrance into the promised land. And so I don't know how we reconcile all of this, but this was always supposed to be the beginning of what was to be theirs. And on Moses' side of the Jordan, they renewed the covenant. So that was God tying himself to the people of Israel and vice versa. But they had to cross over the Jordan for the second part of the ceremony, where they would bind the land to Israel. So there was going to be another part of the covenant being made once they had crossed over the Jordan, but Moses couldn't be a part of that. He would have loved to have been a part of that, to have done the whole ceremony in one go. But he could only do the bit where God would say, "You are my people," and the people would say, "You are my God." But there was still to be the land to be given to them. One day, if we understand it, then this will all be theirs one day. Okay. Then we move on to verse 9 to 18. Too much, I've headed this. It's too much in so many different ways for Moses. There are now 2 million Israelites in the land, 2 million. And Moses is saying it's just too much for him to handle. I can't do it. God has fulfilled his promise in multiplying them. And Moses says, yes, let God keep on multiplying them. Be faithful to your promise. But don't just multiply them as in numbers of people, but multiply them in a spiritual sense as well. He wants to see the fulfillment made to the fathers, the patriarchs, but spiritually as well, because what kind of people have they become? What kind of people have they become? Because they are a massive group of complainers. When we talk about Brits, we're famous for our complaining. It's not good, is it? This is what destroyed the previous generation of Israelites was because of their complaining, and their disobedience, but their complaining was a nightmare. They were just grumpy all the time, and Moses had enough. The complaining got to him. I don't blame him. In verse 12 we find that. And remember, this is Moses giving a history of their journey to now. This is what happened at the beginning of their journey. The proposal is simple enough. Choose some leaders from among yourselves, divide and conquer. Right? If the work is too much for one person, then let's distribute the workload. And we find, actually, if we read Exodus, that the first time that this suggestion was made, it was made by a relative of his father-in-law, Jethro, said, well, actually, this is kind of what he said. He said, "This is ridiculous, son. If you carry on, you're carrying the people all by yourself. You and they will never get there. You've got to divide the work among the people." Unfortunately for him, he never did get there, did he? So the people said, "Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that." And they did that in verse 15. So the heads of the tribes, wise and knowledgeable men, made them heads over you, leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, and officers for your tribes. So Moses then he has to give them some advice. He said, "Well, so far, in a way, I've been your judge, your pastor, your teacher, all this time, but now you've got to listen to some sound advice." And Moses says, "Be careful how you judge. Trust God, because the judgments are God's. You are agents of God's judgment, and if there is a case that you can't handle, bring it to me, and I'll hear it." And we kind of understand that what he means by that is that if it's a difficult case, he will then go to God and seek an answer from him for a bit of divine knowledge and understanding. Yes, that's right, I'll just put that there. So I would take it to the Lord, and we'll ask the Lord for a divine response to a case we can't solve, is kind of what he is saying. So then I'm going to finish off with this today. Onward ho. So people are told, right, time for you to move on from here. They've taken their journey from Horeb, which is Mount Seir. We're not quite sure why he calls it Horeb all the way through here, but it's Mount Seir where the Ten Commandments were first given. The whole area is wilderness. Of course, wilderness is simply desert. Nothing grows there. This is where they were, by the way. Nothing grows there. This is desert. There's no food. There's no water. You have the sun beating down on you. There's nowhere to go for a bit of protection, because there's no vegetation. There's nothing to shade you. And then they arrive at that infamous place called Kadesh Barnea. And next week we'll find out why it has such haunting memories from Moses. So this is a bit of a journey already, but we've covered 38 years, so all in the space of 20 minutes or so. So are there any questions in relation to any of this so far? It was interesting for me to get the geography of the place a bit, because it never occurred to me that they were just north of the Dead Sea, coming from that side. I always imagined they were coming, because they're coming from Egypt, they were going that way over, not that way over, so it was kind of interesting to see how that happened. Still, they were yet to see more miracles, of course, because they were going to cross over the River Jordan, and what was going to happen there? Just like it did for the first generation, separation of the waters. So their second generation were seeing similar miracles, but not on such a grand scale as the first generation. Isn't it amazing that first generation, they saw all these things happen, and they were still faithless in the end? Unbelievable, isn't it? It seems incredible. Just makes us ask questions about ourselves, frankly.
It shows just how little we changed, all these years later.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we haven't changed, have we?
sorry for Moses, though. I always think I was ashamed, that he didn't get to cross over to the promised land. He had a rough deal, didn't he?
I think he had a rough. I think he had a rough deal. One mistake, and that's it. You know,
What was the mistake he made about him?
he struck the rock twice, but he did it out of anger. He did it out of not. No, I'm going to strike this rock. I'm going to produce water for you, and he didn't give glory to God. You see, and that was it. But we'll see a bit of that next week, and again later on, because this is not something that has kind of left his memory. He mentions it 2 or 3 times about this. Yeah. Well, you lose your rag. I mean, he was impatient on a number of occasions. Remember, he broke the 10 Commandments the first time. He didn't get done for that. It was because he did it in a kind of unrighteous way. So, see, I will bring water from this rock. But it wasn't him, was it? It was God. So, but God still answered the miracle, didn't he? But he didn't go in.